Picture this. It's a cold morning in early 1942. A woman named Helen stands outside the gates of the Richmond Kaiser Shipyard in California, staring up at massive steel structures that tower into the gray sky. She's never been this close to a shipyard before. The sounds are deafening. Metal hammering against metal. Cranes groaning under impossible weight. Welders' torches crackling like lightning captured in human hands. She's wearing slacks, not a dress. Work boots, not heels. And in her hand, she clutches a piece of paper that says she's been hired as a welder. Just 6 months ago, Helen was a housewife. She cooked. She cleaned. She took care of her 2 children while her husband worked at an office downtown. But now her husband is somewhere in the Pacific, wearing an army uniform and fighting a war that seems very far away and very real at the same time. And Helen? Helen is about to walk through those shipyard gates and do something that women in America have never done before at this scale. She's about to build ships. Not just any ships. Victory ships. Fast cargo vessels designed to carry troops, weapons, tanks, food, and every single piece of equipment needed to win the biggest war in human history. Each victory ship stretches 455 feet long, weighs over 15,000 tons, and requires more than 150,000 rivets to hold it together. And the United States needs 531 of them. Fast. But here's the problem. The men who used to build these ships are gone. 12 million American men have been drafted or enlisted to fight overseas. The shipyards, the factories, the steel mills, they're all running on empty. In 1939, only 2% of shipyard workers in America were women. 2%. Women simply didn't do this kind of work. It was considered too dangerous, too physically demanding, too complicated. Too masculine. But by 1944, something extraordinary happened. Over 31,000 women worked in just 3 Kaiser shipyards alone. At some yards, women made up 30% of the entire workforce. At the Richmond Kaiser Shipyard, where Helen now stands, 1/3 of the 90,000 workers were women. Women like Helen. Women who had never held a welding torch. Women who had never climbed a scaffold. Women who had never read a blueprint or driven a rivet or operated a crane. So how did this happen? How did American women go from 2% to 30% of the shipbuilding workforce in less than 5 years? How did housewives, secretaries, teachers, and shop girls become the backbone of the greatest industrial mobilization in history? And more importantly, what did they face when they walked through those shipyard gates? This is the story of the most challenging task of World War II that you've probably never heard about in full detail. This is the story of how American women built every single victory ship that sailed across the Atlantic and the Pacific. This is the story of women who shattered every expectation, broke through every barrier, and proved that the phrase, "that's men's work," was nothing more than an outdated lie. Let's go back to 1941, December 7th, Pearl Harbor, the day that changed everything. When Japanese planes attacked the U.S. naval base in Hawaii, America was shocked into action. President Franklin Roosevelt declared war. Congress voted almost unanimously to enter World War II. And suddenly, the entire nation had to mobilize for a conflict that would span the globe. The challenge was staggering. America needed to fight a 2-front war in Europe and in the Pacific. That meant sending millions of troops overseas. But troops can't fight without supplies. They need weapons, ammunition, food, medicine, vehicles, fuel, and all of that has to get across the ocean somehow. That's where the ships came in. In 1941, the United States Merchant Marine had about 1,300 ocean-going cargo ships. That sounds like a lot, but it wasn't nearly enough. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied vessels. The math was brutal. If America couldn't build ships faster than Germany could sink them, the Allies would lose the war. It was that simple. So the US government launched the Emergency Shipbuilding Program. The goal? Build thousands of cargo ships in record time. First came the Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels that could be assembled quickly using prefabricated parts. Then came the Victory ships, an improved design that was faster, stronger, and more versatile. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards would build over 2,700 Liberty ships and 531 Victory ships. But who was going to build them? The men who traditionally worked in shipyards were joining the military by the millions. Experienced welders, riveters, electricians, shipfitters, crane operators, they were all putting on uniforms and shipping out. The shipyards were facing a labor crisis of unprecedented scale. There simply weren't enough workers to meet the demand. The government had a choice. They could slow down production and accept that the war would take longer and cost more lives. Or they could do something radical, something that went against decades of tradition and social norms. They could recruit women. At first, the idea seemed impossible. Shipbuilding wasn't like working in an office or a factory assembly line. It required heavy lifting, dangerous tools, extreme heat, and working at dizzying heights. The work was physically exhausting. Welding torches burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Riveters used pneumatic hammers that shook your entire body. Shipfitters had to climb ladders that stretched several stories high while carrying heavy equipment. Could women really do this? The shipyard managers didn't think so. The union leaders didn't think so. Even many women themselves didn't think so. But the government didn't have a choice. America was fighting for its survival. And survival required ships. Lots of them. Fast. So in 1942, the US government launched one of the most aggressive recruitment campaigns in American history. Posters appeared everywhere. "We can do it," shouted the famous image of a woman in a red bandana flexing her arm. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon, representing the millions of women who were being called to work in war industries. Newspapers ran stories about patriotic women doing their part for the war effort. Radio broadcasts urged women to sign up for training programs. The message was clear. Your country needs you. Your husband, your son, your brother, they're fighting overseas. But you can fight too. You can fight by building the ships that will bring them home. And women responded. By the thousands. By the tens of thousands. Women from all backgrounds, all ages, all walks of life. Housewives who had spent years cooking and cleaning suddenly found themselves learning to weld. College-educated women who might have become teachers or nurses instead became electricians and shipfitters. Women fresh out of high school, barely 18 years old, signed up for the most demanding physical work of their lives. Even grandmothers in their 50s and 60s applied for shipyard jobs. But here's what the propaganda posters didn't show. Here's what the cheerful radio broadcasts didn't mention. The reality of what these women were about to face. The challenges that went far beyond simply learning a new skill. When Helen finally walks through those shipyard gates on that cold morning in 1942, she's not just entering a workplace. She's entering a battlefield. Not the kind with bullets and bombs, though the work is dangerous enough to kill if you make a mistake. No, this is a different kind of battlefield. This is a war against prejudice, against sexism, against every man who thinks women are too weak, too delicate, too incompetent to do real work. Helen doesn't know it yet, but she's about to become part of something much bigger than building ships. She's about to become part of a social revolution that will change America forever. She's about to prove, along with hundreds of thousands of other women, that when the nation calls, Women can answer with strength, skill, and determination that equals any man. But first, she has to survive her first day. She has to learn how to weld. She has to climb those terrifying ladders. She has to face the sneers and the insults from men who don't want her there. She has to work 8-hour shifts in freezing cold or blistering heat. She has to go home exhausted, cook dinner for her children, clean the house, and then wake up the next morning to do it all over again. And she has to do all of this while knowing that if she fails, it's not just her own failure. It's proof, in the eyes of many, that women can't handle this work. That women should go back to the kitchen where they belong. The pressure is immense. The stakes are higher than any individual woman. So the question isn't just, can American women build victory ships? The question is, can American women build every single victory ship while facing challenges that go far beyond the physical demands of the work itself? The question is, can they prove their worth in a world that has spent centuries telling them they're not capable? The answer, as we'll see, is yes. But the story of how they did it is far more complicated, far more challenging, and far more inspiring than any propaganda poster could ever capture. This is that story. This is the real story of American women and the victory ships. And it starts with Helen walking through those shipyard gates, taking a deep breath and stepping into a world that will test every ounce of strength and courage she has. Let's follow her inside. The campaign to recruit women into American shipyards didn't happen by accident. It was carefully planned, meticulously executed, and backed by the full weight of the federal government. In June 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt created the Office of War Information, also known as the OWI, by executive order. The OWI had one primary mission: convince Americans to support the war effort through propaganda that would shape public opinion, boost morale, and most importantly, get women into factories and shipyards. An OWI report from 1942 laid out the strategy in brutally honest terms. Quote, "These jobs will have to be glorified as a patriotic war service if American women are to be persuaded to take them and stick to them. Their importance to a nation engaged in total war must be convincingly presented." End quote. Notice that word, glorified. The government knew that shipyard work wasn't glamorous. It knew the work was dangerous, exhausting, and dirty. But if America was going to build enough ships to win the war, the government had no choice but to make welding torches look appealing. The OWI partnered with private industry and the American media to create what would become one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in U.S. history. Posters appeared on street corners, in post offices, in schools, everywhere Americans looked. Radio broadcasts urged women to do their patriotic duty. Magazine articles featured glamorous photos of women in coveralls, making war work sound attractive to female readers. Even fiction writers were recruited to write stories that portrayed factory work as exciting and meaningful. And then there was Rosie the Riveter, the icon that would define an entire generation of working women. In late 1942, an artist named J. Howard Miller created a painting for the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. The image showed a woman in denim coveralls and a red and white polka dot headscarf, flexing her arm with determination. Above her head, bold letters declared, "We can do it." The poster was originally displayed inside Westinghouse munitions factories for only 2 weeks, from February 15th to February 28th, 1943. It was meant to boost morale and increase production among workers who already had jobs. But after the war, that image took on a life of its own. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of American women's contribution to World War II. She represented strength, capability, and patriotism. The campaign worked. By early 1943, over 16 million women were employed across the country, making up 65% of the total workforce. Women flooded into industries that had been exclusively male for generations. But getting women to show up was only half the battle. The other half was getting shipyards to accept them. Let's be clear about something. Most shipyard managers didn't want women workers. Most union leaders didn't want women workers. And most male shipyard employees definitely didn't want women workers. The resistance was fierce and came from every direction. The unions were particularly problematic. Initially, organizations like the American Federation of Labor and the Independent Brotherhood of Shipyard Workers resisted hiring women. Union leaders argued that women would drive down wages. They claimed women lacked the physical strength for the work. They worried that if women proved capable, men would lose their jobs after the war ended. Some unions even refused to let women join as full members. But the unions faced a problem they couldn't ignore. The government was desperate for workers. Shipyards had contracts to fulfill. Production quotas had to be met. And there simply weren't enough men available to do the work. By 1942, the Bureau of Labor Statistics predicted a shortage of 6 million workers by the end of 1943. 6 million. Without women, the entire war production effort would collapse. So the unions, reluctantly, began to accept women. But that didn't mean they made it easy. Women faced discrimination from day one. They were often assigned the least desirable jobs. They were paid less than men for doing identical work. And they had to endure constant skepticism about their abilities. The male workers were even worse. Many saw women as invaders in a space that belonged to men. Local newspapers in shipyard towns described women as outsiders and a temporary solution to a labor problem that would disappear once the men came home. Some male workers openly mocked the women, making jokes about their physical strength or their lack of experience. Others engaged in outright sexual harassment. One woman who worked at the Vancouver Kaiser Shipyard in Washington state later recalled that she had to request a transfer to a different department because of the harassment she faced from male coworkers. Another woman described how foremen would assign her to the most dangerous or physically demanding tasks, hoping she would quit. The message was clear: you don't belong here. But the women kept coming. They showed up at the shipyard gates by the thousands. They filled out applications. They signed up for training programs. They refused to be intimidated. And slowly, grudgingly, the shipyards opened their doors. At the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, women went from a tiny fraction of the workforce to 1/3 of 90,000 employees by 1944. At the Boston Navy Yard, over 8,000 women were working by 1943. At yards across the country, from Portland, Oregon, to Brunswick, Georgia, women were proving that they could handle work that had been considered impossible for them just a few years earlier. The diversity of these women was remarkable. Some were college-educated and had previously worked as teachers or nurses. Others were fresh out of high school, barely 18 years old, looking for their first real job. There were housewives who had spent years cooking and cleaning. There were women in their 50s and 60s, grandmothers who wanted to contribute to the war effort. There were single mothers trying to support their children while their husbands fought overseas. One of these women was Agnes Smith, a 50-year-old mother of 10 from Greenock, Scotland, who had worked in engineering workshops during World War I. When World War II broke out in 1939, she became a forewoman at a shipyard, supervising 45 other women. Agnes had experience. She knew the work. She knew how to weld, how to rivet, how to operate machinery. And she used that knowledge to train a new generation of women shipbuilders. But most women didn't have Agnes's experience. Most had never held a welding torch. Most had never climbed a scaffold. Most had never read a blueprint or operated a crane. They were starting from zero, and that meant they needed training. Fast. Enter the vocational schools. In 1942, schools like the Pensacola Vocational School in Florida were built specifically to train women for war industry jobs. These schools offered crash courses in welding, riveting, machine shop work, aircraft mechanics, and other essential skills. The courses were intense. Students attended classes 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. The goal was to take someone with zero experience and turn them into a competent welder or riveter in a matter of weeks. At Dravo Corporation and American Bridge Company in Pittsburgh, thousands of women were trained to weld so they could build LSTs, or landing ship, tank vessels. The training lasted about 2 months, during which the women practiced welding techniques until they could pass the certification tests. Then they were sent directly to the shipyards to start building ships. The American Welding Society established codes and minimum requirements for welding instruction, and vocational schools across the country followed these standards. Applications were accepted continuously. Classes ran day and night to accommodate women who had other responsibilities. The entire system was designed for speed. America didn't have time for a leisurely apprenticeship program. Women needed to be trained and deployed to the shipyards immediately. But here's what the propaganda posters didn't show. Here's what the cheerful magazine articles left out. The training was brutal. Welding torches burn at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and you could suffer severe burns. Riveting required using pneumatic hammers that vibrated your entire body and could cause permanent hearing damage from the noise. Climbing scaffolds meant working at heights that terrified women who had never been more than a few feet off the ground. And the women who trained them? Many were men who didn't believe women could learn these skills. Some instructors were supportive and patient. Others were openly hostile, making snide comments about women's abilities or setting impossibly high standards. Women had to prove themselves every single day, in every single class, just to earn the right to take the certification exam. But they did it. They learned to weld. They learned to rivet. They learned to read blueprints and operate cranes and climb scaffolds. The first woman trained at the Pensacola Vocational School was hired at Eglin Field, an Army Air Force base in Florida. Soon, 75 women trained at that school were working at the Naval Air Station. At Dravo and American Bridge, sisters Vera, Julie, and Andrzejewicz all completed welding school and started building LSTs in 1943. Vera went first in May, and her sisters followed in July. This pattern repeated itself across the country. Women trained together, applied together, and worked together. They formed support networks that helped them survive in an environment that was often hostile to their presence. Chain employment through family or social ties became common. Women learned about job openings through word of mouth and helped each other get hired. When they entered the factory floor or the shipyard for the first time, many welcomed the presence of friends or family members who could help them navigate this strange new world. Some women commuted as much as 2 hours each way to reach the shipyards. They carpooled because gas was rationed and cars were scarce. They woke up before dawn, packed lunches, and prepared for 8 or 9-hour shifts doing the most physically demanding work of their lives. And at the end of the day, they went home to cook dinner, clean the house, and take care of their children. The barriers they broke through weren't just physical. They were social. They were cultural. They were psychological. For generations, American society had told women that their place was in the home, that they were too weak for heavy industry, that they lacked the intelligence to understand complex machinery, that they were too emotional to handle dangerous work. And now women were proving all of that wrong. They were walking through those shipyard gates. They were picking up welding torches. They were climbing those scaffolds. They were doing the impossible. And in doing so, they were changing America forever. But the real challenge was just beginning. Training was one thing. Actually building a victory ship? That was something else entirely. Let's talk about what it actually meant to learn welding in 1942 if you were a woman who had never touched industrial equipment in your life. The training programs were designed for speed, not comfort. Women attended classes 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a total of 490 hours of instruction. That's roughly 2 months of intensive, hands-on training compressed into a schedule that left no room for hesitation. At the Pensacola Vocational School in Florida, women learned oxyacetylene welding, electric welding, machine shop operations, aircraft sheet metal work, and boat building. The American Welding Society had established codes and minimum requirements for welding instruction, and schools across the country followed these standards to ensure that every graduate could pass the certification tests. This wasn't a casual hobby class. This was industrial training designed to produce workers who could immediately step onto a factory floor or shipyard and start building war machines. The welding torch itself was intimidating. It burns at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. One mistake, one moment where your hand slips or your concentration wavers, and you suffer severe burns that could put you out of work for weeks or end your career entirely. Mildred Oppid, who trained at Dravo Corporation and American Bridge Company in Pittsburgh, later recalled that her welding rod fell into her shoe during work, causing painful burns. That was the reality of the job. Danger was constant, but the training pushed forward anyway. Women practiced different types of welds over and over again until their hands knew the movements by muscle memory. They learned to weld in smooth, neat lines, creating joints that were stronger and more precise than many of their male counterparts. Mildred Oppid would later say that she could spot the difference between a woman's weld and a man's weld just by looking at it. The women welded meticulously because they had something to prove. Quote, "They didn't care, but we did. We wanted to do good, so we did," end quote. During World War II, the aircraft industry developed and perfected gas tungsten arc welding, also known as TG welding, for working with magnesium and aluminum. TG welding became the primary process for aircraft construction because it was much faster than torch welding. Women learned these new techniques alongside men, mastering technology that was being invented and refined in real time. They weren't just learning an old trade. They were becoming part of an industrial revolution. Riveting was equally demanding. A riveter used a pneumatic hammer to drive metal rivets through steel plates, creating joints that held the entire ship together. The average Liberty ship required 150,000 rivets. The average Victory ship required even more. Each rivet had to be driven with precision. Too loose, and the joint would fail. Too tight, and the metal could crack. And the noise was deafening. Pneumatic hammers created sound levels that could cause permanent hearing damage. Women riveters worked on every part of the aircraft and ship construction process. They riveted center wing sections for B-24E Liberator bombers at the Ford Motor Company plant in Willow Run, Michigan. They riveted cowlings for bombers, transparent noses for A-20 attack aircraft, bodywork near cockpits, and entire fuselages. They climbed scaffolds, worked in confined spaces, and operated equipment that vibrated their entire bodies for hours at a time. The physical demands were brutal. Women had to lift heavy equipment, carry their own welding cables, and work in positions that strained every muscle in their bodies. Certain tasks, such as working in confined spaces or handling materials that required significant upper body strength, were more physically challenging for women due to differences in average strength and body size compared to their male counterparts. But the shipyards didn't always provide accommodations. Women were expected to do the same work as men, using the same tools in the same conditions. And the conditions were harsh. Medical records from the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, documented 13,261 total fractures among workers, mostly to the hands, feet, and ribs. One woman fractured her skull after a 60-foot fall from the top deck of a hull. Women welders were exposed to toxic vaporized metals like copper and zinc, which caused respiratory problems and other occupational diseases. Slip and fall injuries were common on wet and slippery deck surfaces. Burns and scalds happened regularly in engine rooms and galleys. Crush injuries were a constant threat when working with heavy equipment and cargo. Hand-arm vibration syndrome, caused by using vibrating tools for extended periods, led to hand pain, numbness, and loss of dexterity. Repetitive strain injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome affected women who performed manual labor for 8 or 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. Respiratory problems developed from exposure to hazardous materials, fumes, and confined spaces. The training programs tried to prepare women for these dangers, but there was only so much you could learn in a classroom. Real experience came on the job, where mistakes could be fatal. Women learned to be cautious. They learned to double-check their equipment. They learned to watch out for each other. At the Pensacola Vocational School, women became acquainted with at least 50 different kinds of tools: hammers, rulers, saws, scribes, and dozens of others. They learned to read blueprints, understanding the technical drawings that showed them exactly where each weld needed to be placed, how thick each joint needed to be, and what specifications the finished product had to meet. Blueprint reading was a skill that required spatial reasoning and attention to detail. One misread measurement could result in a part that didn't fit, wasting time and materials. Women also learned to operate cranes and other heavy machinery. Crane operators had to have perfect depth perception and steady nerves. They lifted loads weighing thousands of pounds, maneuvering them into position with precision. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the load could swing wildly, injuring or killing workers on the ground below. The training wasn't just technical. It was psychological. Women had to overcome fear. Fear of heights when they climbed scaffolds that towered several stories into the air. Fear of failure when they took their certification exams, knowing that if they didn't pass, they might not get another chance. Fear of judgment from male instructors and coworkers who were waiting for them to quit. Mildred Oppett admitted that she was scared to death of water, yet she worked for years on ships sitting just above the waterline. She faced her fear every single day because the paycheck mattered. $1.25 per hour for an 8-hour shift. That money allowed her to send part of her earnings back home to her mother and siblings while saving $2,500 for herself. Quote, "Money makes you do a lot of things," end quote, Oppett stated in her oral history interview. And she wasn't alone. Thousands of women pushed through fear, exhaustion, and pain because they needed the income. Some were supporting families while their husbands fought overseas. Others were single mothers with children to feed. Still others were young women who wanted economic independence for the first time in their lives. The training programs created a pipeline of skilled workers that kept American shipyards and factories operating at maximum capacity. The first woman trained at the Pensacola Vocational School was hired at Eglin Field, an Army Air Force base in Florida. Soon, 75 women trained at that school were working at the Naval Air Station. At Dravo Corporation and American Bridge Company, sisters Vera, Julie, and Andrzejewicz all completed welding school and started building landing ship tank vessels in 1943. Vera went first in May, and her sisters followed in July. Chain employment through family or social ties became common. Women learned about job openings through word of mouth. They helped each other get hired. They formed support networks that made survival in hostile work environments possible. When they entered the shipyard for the first time, many welcomed the presence of friends or family members who could help them navigate this strange new world. Some women commuted as much as 2 hours each way to reach the shipyards. They carpooled because gas was rationed and personal vehicles were scarce. They woke up before dawn, packed lunches, and prepared for shifts that would leave them physically and mentally exhausted by the end of the day. And when the shift ended, their work wasn't done. They went home to cook dinner, clean the house, and take care of their children. They mended clothes, shopped for groceries with ration stamps, and tried to get a few hours of sleep before waking up to do it all over again. The double burden was real and relentless. But they learned. They became welders, riveters, crane operators, electricians, shipfitters, machinists, and more. They took skills that society had told them were impossible for women to master, and they mastered them anyway. They proved that with proper training and determination, women could do anything men could do. And now it was time to put those skills to the ultimate test. It was time to build a victory ship. Before we can understand what women accomplished in building victory ships, we need to understand exactly what a victory ship was. These weren't small boats. These weren't simple vessels. These were massive, complex cargo ships designed to carry the weight of an entire war effort across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. A victory ship measured 455 feet long and 62 feet wide. To put that in perspective, that's longer than a football field. The ship drew 28 feet of water when fully loaded and had a depth of hold measuring 38 feet. Displacement came in at 15,200 tons when fully loaded. Deadweight tonnage, the actual cargo carrying capacity, was 10,850 tons. That meant each victory ship could transport thousands of tons of cargo, ammunition, vehicles, food, medical supplies, and troops across the Atlantic or Pacific. The ship's designation told you everything about its design. VC2, S, AP2, for example, meant V for victory, C2 for emergency cargo type 2 with a load waterline length between 400 and 450 feet, S for steam propulsion, and AP2, meaning one aft propeller with a 6,000 horsepower steam turbine engine. The VC2 S AP3 variant used an 8,500 horsepower engine, making it slightly faster. The VC2M AP4 used a diesel engine, though only one ship of this type was ever built. Victory ships were the evolution of Liberty ships, which had been mass-produced since 1941. Liberty ships were emergency cargo vessels designed for rapid construction using prefabricated parts and assembly line techniques. They worked. American shipyards built over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. But they had problems. Liberty's ships were slow. They made about 11 knots, maybe less in bad weather. That made them vulnerable to German U-boats, which could cruise at speeds up to 17 knots on the surface. A U-boat could chase down a Liberty ship, position itself for a torpedo attack, and sink the ship before it could escape. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied vessels. The math was brutal. America was building ships as fast as possible, but Germany was sinking them faster. Liberty ships also had structural problems. The hulls were welded rather than riveted, which sped up construction but created weak points in the metal. The frames were spaced 30 inches apart, making the hull very rigid. In cold weather, especially in the North Atlantic during convoy runs to Murmansk, the metal became brittle. Some Liberty ships developed cracks in their hulls. Some broke in half and sank. The United States War Shipping Administration, formed in February 1942, immediately commissioned the design of an improved cargo ship. Initially designated EC2, S, AP1, where EC2 stood for Emergency Cargo Type 2, The design was changed to VC2S AP1 before the name Victory Ship was officially adopted on April 28, 1943. The goal was to fix everything that was wrong with the Liberty ships while keeping construction time as short as possible. Victory ships were 14 feet longer than Liberty ships at 455 feet versus 441 feet. They were 6 feet wider at 62 feet versus 56 feet. They drew 1 foot more water when loaded at 28 feet versus 27 feet. Displacement increased by just under 1,000 tons, from 14,444 tons on a Liberty ship to 15,200 tons on a Victory ship. But the real improvements were under the surface. Victory ships had more modern, efficient engines. Instead of the Liberty ship's 2,500 horsepower triple expansion steam engine, Victory ships used steam turbines producing between 6,000 and 8,500 horsepower, depending on the variant. That extra power translated directly into speed. Victory ships made 15 to 17 knots, 4 to 6 knots faster than Liberty ships. Some of the faster Victory ships with the AP3 turbines could hit 18 knots. That speed difference was everything. At 17 knots, a Victory ship could outrun most German U-boats on the surface. It could get cargo to the front lines faster, reducing the time spent in dangerous waters. It could cross the Atlantic or Pacific in less time, making more voyages per year and increasing overall shipping capacity. The steam turbines also enabled another major improvement: electrically powered auxiliary equipment. Liberty ships used steam-driven machinery for almost everything, from cargo winches to capstans to pumps. Victory ships had turbo generators that produced large amounts of electrical power, allowing the use of electric motors instead. This simplified operation, reduced maintenance, and improved reliability. The whole design was different too. Victory ships had a raised forecastle and a more streamlined, V-shaped hull that helped achieve higher speed and better seakeeping. The frame spacing was increased from 30 inches to 36 inches. That 6-inch difference might not sound like much, but it was critical. The wider frame spacing made the hull less rigid and more flexible. The ship could twist slightly in heavy seas without cracking. This single change prevented the catastrophic hull failures that had plagued Liberty ships. Like Liberty ships, Victory ship hulls were welded rather than riveted. But the welding had to be better. Each weld had to be perfect, because one bad weld could create a weak point that would eventually crack under stress. That's where women like Mildred Oppid came in, welding smooth, neat lines that were stronger and more precise than many of their male counterparts. Victory ships were also heavily armed. The VC2S AP2, VC2S AP3, and VC2M AP4 variants carried a 5-inch, 38 caliber stern gun for use against submarines and surface ships, a 3-inch, 50 caliber bow-mounted gun, and 820mm cannon for anti-aircraft defense. These weapons were manned by United States Navy Armed Guard personnel who sailed with the civilian merchant marine crew. The VC2S AP5 Haskell-class attack transports, designed to carry 1,500 soldiers in converted cargo holds, were even more heavily armed with a 5-inch stern gun, one quad 40mm Bofors cannon, for dual 40mm Bofors cannon, and 10 single 20mm cannon. The standard Victory ship crew consisted of 99 personnel. That included officers, engineers, deck crew, and naval armed guard. But in wartime conditions, with cargo being loaded and unloaded as quickly as possible, dozens of additional workers could be on board at any given time. The cargo capacity was impressive. A Victory ship could carry approximately 453,210 cubic feet of cargo. That's over 12,800 cubic meters. The ship could transport tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, ammunition crates, food supplies, medical equipment, fuel drums, construction materials, and anything else the military needed. Some Victory ships were converted to carry oil or other liquid cargo. Others were modified as troop transports. Range was approximately 23,500 miles at cruising speed. That meant a Victory ship could cross the Atlantic or Pacific multiple times without refueling. Fuel capacity was 2,833 tons. The ship burned oil-fired boilers to generate steam for the turbines, and the United States needed 531 of these ships. 531 vessels, each 455 feet long, each weighing over 15,000 tons, each requiring thousands of welds, hundreds of thousands of rivets, miles of electrical wiring, complex machinery, and precise construction to incredibly tight tolerances. The emergency shipbuilding program set quotas that seemed impossible. Shipyards across the country were expected to produce these ships in a matter of months, not years. The SS Red Oak Victory, built at the Richmond Kaiser Shipyard in California, was produced in just 88 days. 88 days from keel laying to launch. That meant every single component had to be prefabricated, delivered on time, and installed correctly the first time. There was no room for error. There was no time to redo work. And who was doing this work? Women. Women who 6 months earlier had been housewives, secretaries, teachers, and shop girls. Women who had never built anything larger than a bookshelf were now building ships that would carry the weight of the war effort across the world's oceans. The Victory ship was a beast. A massive, complex, sophisticated piece of machinery that required thousands of hours of skilled labor to construct. And American women were about to prove they could build every single one. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. By 1943, Kaiser workers were producing a Liberty ship on average in just 42 days, completing 3 each day. 3 ships, every single day, each one 441 feet long, weighing 14,000 tons, ready to sail across the ocean and carry cargo to the front lines. And women were an essential part of making that happen. Let's put this in perspective. At the start of the Liberty ship program in 1941, it took an average of 355 days and 1.4 million man-hours to build a single ship. By 1943, that figure had dropped to an average of 41 days and under 500,000 man-hours, which equals 57 man-years of labor. That's an 88% reduction in construction time. Henry Kaiser's 4 Richmond shipyards produced a total of 747 ships during World War II, including 18% of all Liberty ships built. That's more ships built at one location than anywhere else in the world, before or since. Richmond held 2 significant speed records, the lowest average number of construction days per ship among all Liberty shipbuilding programs at 42 days, and the fastest single ship completed from keel laying to launch. That record was the SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes in November 1942. 4 days. Let that sink in. The keel was laid at 12:01 a.m. on November 8, 1942. The ship was launched at 3:27 p.m. on November 12th. It was delivered for service on November 15th, setting an additional record of 7 days, 14 hours, and 32 minutes from laying the keel to delivery. How is that even possible? Prefabrication, mass production, assembly line techniques borrowed directly from the automobile industry. Kaiser didn't build ships the traditional way, where skilled craftsmen slowly assembled each component on site. Instead, he treated shipbuilding like building cars. The entire ship was broken down into 250-ton sections that were prefabricated throughout the country and then welded together at the shipyards. At the Richmond Shipyard, Fabrication shops produced more than 1,000 tons of steel components per day. The bottom shell unit was installed first, followed by the inner bottom unit to support the boiler, engine, and pump. The boilers were put in place by mid-morning. Transverse bulkheads and the shaft tunnel came next. The upper deck was completed on the second day. Masts, derricks, and superstructure were installed on the third day. During the final day, wiring, welding, and painting were completed along with the installation of the forward gun platform and the inner stack. All told, 250,000 individual parts weighing 14 million pounds were assembled in less than 5 days. Someone who worked at the Richmond shipyards later recalled that, quote, "If you dropped a quarter on the deck, it would be welded before you could pick it up," end quote. That's how fast the work moved. The Robert E. Peary was what Kaiser called an incentive ship, meant to show that the United States could produce ships faster than Germany could sink them. It was a propaganda effort, a stunt designed to boost morale. Normally, the Permanente yard took an average of about 50 days to build a Liberty ship. But even 50 days was astonishing compared to the year it took before the war. And the pace only accelerated. By 1944, Henry Kaiser and his colleagues were building 50 merchant ships a day across all American shipyards. 50 ships. Every single day. That's one ship launched every 28 minutes, around the clock. All of Kaiser's shipyards together produced 1,490 ships, which amounted to 27% of total U.S. Maritime Commission construction. His ships were completed in 2/3 the time and at a quarter the cost of the average of all other shipyards. The total workforce at Kaiser's yards alone exceeded 100,000 workers. Another 45,000 were employed at Mare Island, 22,000 at Marinship, 35,000 at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco, and another 35,000 at Moore Dry Dock in Oakland. Nearly overnight, San Francisco Bay had emerged as the greatest shipbuilding center in the world. And women were everywhere. At the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards, 1/3 of the 90,000 workers were women. That's 30,000 women welding, riveting, fitting pipes, installing electrical systems, operating cranes, and doing every other job necessary to build a ship. At the 3 Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver and Portland, over 31,000 women were working by 1944. In total, the 3 Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver and Portland produced over 700 ships, accounting for 30% of all ship production under the U.S. Maritime Commission. Victory ships came next. The first Victory ship, SS United Victory, was launched in February 1944. Between 1944 and 1946, American shipyards produced 531 Victory ships. Oregon Shipbuilding built 99 Victory ships along with 330 Liberty ships and 33 attack transports. The Vancouver shipyard's output included 31 Victory ships, 16 Liberty ships, 49 escort carriers, 21 troop transport ships, and 30 LST landing ships. The SS American Victory, a VC-2S, AP-2 type cargo ship, was built in just 55 days and delivered to the U.S. War Shipping Administration by the California Shipbuilding Yard on May 20, 1945. The SS Red Oak Victory, a VC-2S, AP-2 built at Richmond Shipyard No. 3, was produced in 88 days. That became the standard. Victory ships took roughly 2 to 3 months to build from keeling to delivery. Victory ships required 15% more labor hours per ton than Liberty ships. The design was more complex. The steam turbines were more sophisticated. The hull had to be more precisely constructed to achieve the higher speeds. Yards saw significant productivity declines when they switched from building Liberty ships to building Victory ships because workers had to learn new techniques and adapt to new specifications. But they did it anyway. Women adapted. They learned the new welding patterns required for the different hull design. They mastered the installation of the more powerful turbine engines. They wired the electrical systems that powered the auxiliary equipment. They climbed into the cramped spaces inside the hull to install bulkheads and piping. The average Victory ship required more than 150,000 rivets, just like the Liberty ships. Each rivet had to be driven by hand using a pneumatic hammer. Rosie the Riveter, working at the Easton, Pennsylvania, facility of the National Air Corporation, set a production record by driving 3,345 rivets in a single 6-hour shift. That's 9 rivets per minute for 6 straight hours. President Roosevelt personally congratulated her for the achievement. And she wasn't alone. Thousands of women riveters worked at speeds that would have been considered impossible before the war. They competed with each other to see who could drive the most rivets per shift. They took pride in their work, knowing that every rivet they drove brought the ship one step closer to completion. The welding was even more critical. Victory ships had welded hulls, not riveted ones. Every single weld had to be perfect. One bad weld could create a weak point that would eventually crack under stress, potentially sinking the ship and killing everyone aboard. Women welders like Mildred Oppid knew the stakes. Quote, "We wanted to do good, so we did," end quote. Their welds were smooth, neat, and stronger than many of their male counterparts. The scale of production was staggering. Each Victory ship contained approximately 12,800 cubic meters of cargo space. Each ship weighed over 15,000 tons when fully loaded. Each ship was powered by a 6,000 to 8,500 horsepower steam turbine engine. Each ship had miles of electrical wiring, hundreds of valves and pumps, complex steering mechanisms, navigation equipment, weapon systems, and living quarters for a crew of 99. And American shipyards were building these ships in less than 3 months. Not years. Not even 6 months. Less than 3 months from laying the keel to launching the completed vessel. This wasn't just impressive. It was unprecedented in human history. No nation had ever mobilized industrial production on this scale, at this speed, with this level of efficiency. And women were making it happen. But here's what the numbers don't tell you. Here's what the production statistics leave out. The human cost, the exhaustion, the injuries, the constant pressure to work faster, produce more, never make mistakes. The women who climbed scaffolds despite being terrified of heights. The women who worked through pain from repetitive strain injuries because they couldn't afford to miss a shift. The women who went home covered in burns, bruises, and welding scars. The women who did all of this while knowing that if they failed, if production slowed down, if the ships didn't get built fast enough, American soldiers would die. The weight of that responsibility never left them. So yes, American shipyards built 3 ships a day. They built 747 ships at Richmond alone. They built 531 Victory ships in just over 2 years. But behind every one of those numbers was a woman who sacrificed her safety, her health, and sometimes her life to make it happen. And we're just getting started. Because the real story isn't the production numbers. The real story is what it was like to actually work in those shipyards day after day, facing dangers that could kill in an instant. Let's step into the daily life of a woman working at a World War II shipyard and understand what that really meant. The workday started with the sound of an alarm clock going off in the darkness before dawn. Women woke up, got dressed in their work clothes, slacks instead of dresses, work boots instead of heels, and headed out the door. There were 3 shifts running around the clock: the day shift, the swing shift, and the graveyard shift. Shifts were changed weekly, which meant workers never developed a consistent sleep schedule. One week they'd be working days. The next week they'd be working nights. The constant rotation wreaked havoc on their bodies and their family lives. Stella Vogel, a tank cleaner at Kaiser, recalled the tension created by working different shifts from her husband. Quote, "At 11 o'clock, I had to fix his lunch and get him ready. We worked different shifts. He worked the midnight shift. On my day off, I'd have to do the washing and ironing. And on his day off, he went to the movies all day long. I can remember him being there," end quote. Eventually, the couple ended up seeking a divorce. It was entirely possible for a couple working in the shipyards to not even be able to share their days off with each other. Some women commuted as much as 2 hours each way to reach the shipyards. They carpooled because gas was rationed and personal vehicles were scarce. They arrived at the gates and punched in their time cards under the big clock on the wall. The workday was 8 to 9 hours long, depending on the shift and the production demands. Phyllis Key Gould, now 98 years old, recalled her first days at the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond. Quote, "I had never worked before in my life," end quote, she said while standing next to the Rosie the Riveter memorial at the site of the shipyard. Thousands of other women joined alongside her, becoming welders and shipfitters to contribute to the war effort. Gould loved the work. Quote, "I adored the appearance of welding, the scent of it. You'd peer through really dark glass, and all you would see was the arc. You'd move the welding in small, circular motions, crafting half-crescents. When done correctly, it was stunning. It resembled embroidery," end quote. That's one perspective. The artistic beauty of a perfect weld, the satisfaction of creating something with precision and skill. But Bethina Moore, who relocated from DeRuyter, Louisiana, where she had worked in a laundry, remembered something different. Weighing just 110 pounds, she was assigned one of the most perilous jobs, descending a narrow steel ladder attached to a welding machine for stories down into the ship's double hulls. Quote, "It was dark and frightening. It felt sorrowful because a war was ongoing. You understood your purpose. The men overseas might not return. Lives were at stake, so the welding had to be flawless," end quote. That was the constant pressure. Every weld had to be perfect. Every rivet had to be driven correctly. Every electrical connection had to be secure. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and the ship could fail at sea, killing everyone aboard. The women knew this. They carried that weight every single day. The working conditions were extreme. In the winter, it was bitter cold. Workers wore warm underwear, warm gloves, goggles to keep flying objects from getting in their eyes, and heavy work shoes and helmets to protect their heads from possible falling objects. Fires were built in tremendous barrels to help keep them warm. In the summer, the heat inside the ships was unbearable. Women welded in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces where temperatures soared. The noise was deafening. Pneumatic hammers, riveting guns, metal being cut and shaped, machinery running constantly. A recent noise survey of a modern shipyard in Goa, India, revealed that noise levels exceed 90 decibels in many areas, with levels being highly variable depending on the type of shipbuilding activity. During World War II, there were no regulations limiting noise exposure. There was no requirement to wear hearing protection. Workers were simply expected to endure it. The result? Permanent hearing damage for thousands of women. Studies of shipbuilders have found a high prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss compared to office workers, despite workplace regulations being in place. An alarming 76% of shipbuilders were inconsistent users of earplugs, 6% of whom had already developed a temporary threshold shift, which is the precursor to noise-induced hearing loss. And that's with modern safety equipment. During World War II, many workers had no hearing protection at all. Workers climbed ladders to reach the higher decks or descended into the bottom of the hull. They were very careful since they carried tools, and there was open space around the ladders. One slip, one moment of lost balance, and they could fall several stories. Medical records from the Kaiser Shipyards documented 13,261 total fractures among workers, mostly to the hands, feet, and ribs. One woman fractured her skull after a 60-foot fall from the top deck of a hull. Women welders were exposed to toxic vaporized metals like copper and zinc, which caused respiratory problems and other occupational diseases. Slip and fall injuries were common on wet and slippery deck surfaces. Burns and scalds happened regularly, especially when welding overhead. Phyllis Key Gould recalled that her arms, like those of many female shipyard workers, still bore faint white scars from metal sparkles, molten slag that slipped into her sleeves and gloves while she welded overhead. Many women continued to carry their well-worn welding certificates in their wallets decades later. The work was physically exhausting. Women lifted heavy equipment, carried welding cables, operated pneumatic tools that vibrated their entire bodies for hours at a time. They worked in awkward positions, crouched inside holes, reaching overhead, contorting their bodies to access tight spaces. Repetitive strain injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome affected women who performed manual labor for 8 or 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. Hand-arm vibration syndrome, caused by using vibrating tools for extended periods, led to hand pain, numbness, and loss of dexterity. Crush injuries were a constant threat when working with heavy equipment and cargo. The physical hazards included noise exposure, extreme temperatures, vibration, awkward body positions, and the risk of musculoskeletal injuries. And the women worked alongside male employees who often didn't believe they were up to the job. Some men were supportive. Others were openly hostile, making snide comments, refusing to help, or actively sabotaging women's work. Women had to prove themselves every single day, performing at a higher level just to be considered equal. At the peak of the war, women, many of whom were African American, constituted over a quarter of the 90,000 workers in the Kaiser Richmond shipyards. From 1942 to 1945, nearly 500,000 African Americans migrated to California, with about 15,000 settling in Richmond alone. This was the largest voluntary migration of African Americans westward in the nation's history. With the establishment of the Kaiser Yards in 1942, Richmond became the site of the highest concentration of shipbuilding in the country. Women of all backgrounds worked side by side. College-educated women, girls fresh from high school, married women, grandmothers, women with husbands or brothers fighting overseas. Between 15 and 20% of shipyard workers were women, numbering over 8,000 in 1943 at the Boston Navy Yard alone. These women were thrown into roles that the shipbuilding world had not previously opened to them. Though some worked in clerical positions that had been deemed acceptable for women since World War I, the great majority became welders and electricians, machine operators and pipe fitters, mechanics and painters. They took their tools to the hulls of new ships under construction, or spent their workdays in one of the many specialized shops that produced ship components. The shift ended after 8 or 9 hours. Workers punched out, exhausted, covered in dirt and metal dust, their ears ringing from the noise, their muscles aching from the physical labor. But their day wasn't over. Not even close. When they returned home, they were expected to shop, cook and clean, care for children, and attend to other duties of women in the home. This expectation plagued shipbuilding women everywhere. Rather than solely fulfilling their patriotic duty by building ships for the war effort, they were expected to accomplish both functions simultaneously: welding, lifting loads, and sweeping before going home to clean, bake meals, and care for children. This left them little to no time for respite. Mildred Kane, a teacher at Kaiser's Child Care Center, was a victim of this overwhelming schedule and remembered that, quote, "We were just frantic on the 7th day. Sundays, we didn't know whether to clean the house and wash our hair or rush off and go on a picnic or rest, end quote. As a single woman, Kane had more choice in the matter. Women with families often had no other option than to tackle chores on their day off. The Kaiser Shipyards did try to help. They operated child care centers that were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that workers of all shifts could have access. This was revolutionary for the time. Women who worked in the Kaiser Shipyards helped lay the groundwork for a new era of greater employment opportunities and child care options. But even with child care available, the burden was immense. Women woke up before dawn. They worked 8 or 9-hour shifts doing physically demanding, dangerous work. They went home and took care of their families. They got a few hours of sleep. Then they woke up and did it all over again. And they did this for months, for years, for the entire duration of the war. Because they knew that if they didn't, if production slowed down, if the ships didn't get built, American soldiers would die. The stakes were too high to quit. This was the reality of shipyard work for women during World War II. Not glamorous, not easy, not safe, but absolutely essential to winning the war. On June 8, 1943, something extraordinary happened at the General Motors Eastern Aircraft Division in Tarrytown, New York. A riveter named Rosie the Riveter and her work partner Jenny Florio were assigned to work on a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber during their overnight shift. They drilled 900 holes and placed 3,345 rivets in that single aircraft. 3,345 rivets in one shift, without a single mistake. To understand how incredible this was, you need to understand what riveting actually involved. The average Liberty ship required about 150,000 rivets. Each rivet had to be heated until it glowed red, inserted into a pre-drilled hole, and then hammered using a pneumatic tool until the metal mushroomed on both ends, creating a permanent joint. The work was loud, physically exhausting, and required absolute precision. Too loose and the joint would fail. Too tight and the metal could crack. Rosie the Riveter's record meant she was driving an average of 9 rivets per minute for 6 straight hours. 9 per minute. That's 1 rivet every 6.6 seconds. Pick up the rivet. Position it. Drive it home. Move to the next hole. Repeat. Again and again and again. For 6 hours without a break, without slowing down, without making a single error. For this astonishing feat, she was dubbed Rosie the Riveter by the press. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally sent her a letter of commendation. Quote, she received a personal letter from President Roosevelt himself, end quote. Already, women were doing things just as well as a man could, if not better. They were breaking records and, because no woman had ever done it before, receiving national attention from the president. But here's the interesting part. Rosie the Riveter set her record on June 8, 1943. Just 10 days earlier, on May 29, 1943, Norman Rockwell's painting of Rosie the Riveter had appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. The timing was almost too perfect. The image of Rosie and the real-life record-breaking Rosie appeared within weeks of each other, creating a cultural moment that would define the era. Norman Rockwell's illustration features a brawny woman taking her lunch break with a rivet gun on her lap, and beneath her penny loafer a copy of Adolf Hitler's manifesto, Mein Kampf. Her lunchbox reads Rosie, and viewers quickly recognized that to be Rosie the Riveter from the familiar song. Rockwell, America's best-known popular illustrator of the day, based the pose of his Rosie on that of Michelangelo's 1509 painting Prophet Isaiah from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The woman's blue overalls are adorned with badges and buttons, a Red Cross blood donor button, a white V for Victory button, a Blue Star Mother's pin, an Army-Navy E-Service Production Award pin, 2 Bronze Civilian Service Awards, and her personal identity badge. She's holding a ham sandwich in her left hand, muscular and confident, a woman who clearly knows her worth. Rockwell's model was a Vermont resident, 19-year-old Mary Louise Doyle, who was a telephone operator near where Rockwell lived, not a riveter. Rockwell painted his Rosie as a larger woman than his model, and he later phoned to apologize. According to Doyle's obituaries, 24 years after she posed, Rockwell sent Doyle a letter calling her the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen and apologizing for the hefty body in the painting. Quote, "I did have to make you into a sort of a giant," end quote, he wrote. The Saturday Evening Post cover image proved hugely popular, and the magazine loaned it to the U.S. Treasury Department for the duration of the war for use in war bond drives. It became one of the most recognizable images of World War II and continues to symbolize women's empowerment to this day. But the extraordinary ability of some women who worked in the shipyards to become very efficient riveters had already been recognized before either Rockwell's painting or Rosie Benavita's record. Women were proving themselves every single day, setting informal records, competing with each other to increase production. At the Kaiser Shipyards, women competed to see who could weld the cleanest, strongest joints. Mildred Oppid later recalled that she could spot the difference between a woman's weld and a man's weld just by looking at it. Women welded meticulously because they had something to prove. Quote, "They didn't care, but we did. We wanted to do good, so we did," end quote. This competitive spirit drove production to levels that had been considered impossible. Kaiser workers were producing a Liberty ship on average in just 42 days by 1943, completing 3 each day. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes in November 1942. These weren't just records. These were statements. Proof that American industrial might, powered by women's labor, could outproduce anything the Axis powers could manage. The women took pride in their work. They wore their welding certificates in their wallets for decades after the war ended. They remembered the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the feeling that they were contributing something meaningful to the war effort. Phyllis Key Gould, who worked at the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, recalled decades later, quote, "I adored the appearance of welding, the scent of it. You'd peer through really dark glass, and all you would see was the arc. You'd move the welding in small, circular motions, crafting half-crescents. When done correctly, it was stunning. It resembled embroidery," end quote. Another real-life Rosie was Rose Monroe, a riveter at the Willow Run Bomber Plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. In 1944, actor Walter Pidgeon discovered her and recruited her to star in a film promoting the sale of war bonds. She became one of the public faces of the Rosie the Riveter campaign, appearing in propaganda films that urged Americans to support the war effort. At least 4 different women are lauded as the real Rosie. Rosie Benavita Hickey, who set the riveting record. Rose Monroe, who starred in the war bond films. Naomi Parker Fraley, who worked at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, and was photographed operating a lathe, an image that may have inspired the "We Can Do It" poster. And Geraldine Hoff Doyle, who was mistakenly identified for years as the woman in that poster. The truth is, there were thousands of Rosies. Thousands of women welding, riveting, fitting pipes, installing electrical systems, operating cranes, and doing every other job necessary to build ships. Each one of them was Rosie the Riveter. Each one of them set personal records, pushed themselves to their limits, and proved that women could do work that society had told them was impossible. The competitions weren't always official. Sometimes they were just women challenging themselves to work faster, weld cleaner, rivet more precisely than they had the day before. Sometimes they were friendly rivalries between work partners. Sometimes they were shipyard-wide campaigns to increase production. But the result was the same. Production soared. By 1944, Henry Kaiser and his colleagues were building 50 merchant ships a day across all American shipyards. 50 ships. Every single day. One ship launched every 28 minutes around the clock. And women were making it happen. They were the ones driving those rivets. They were the ones making those welds. They were the ones climbing into dangerous spaces, working at dizzying heights, operating heavy machinery, and doing whatever was necessary to get the job done. Rosie the Riveter's record of 3,345 rivets in one shift became legendary. But it was just one moment in a story that involved hundreds of thousands of women working millions of shifts over several years. The real record wasn't the number of rivets one woman drove in 6 hours. The real record was the total number of ships built by all the women working together. 747 ships at the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards alone. 531 Victory ships total. Over 2,700 Liberty ships. Hundreds of other vessels, from escort carriers to landing ships to attack transports. Each ship represented thousands of hours of labor. Each ship represented thousands of rivets driven, thousands of welds made, thousands of precise measurements and careful installations. Each ship represented women pushing themselves beyond what they thought they were capable of. And each ship sailed across the Atlantic or the Pacific, carrying troops, weapons, supplies, and everything else needed to win the war. Each ship was a testament to what American women could accomplish when given the opportunity. That was the real competition. Not between individual women, though those rivalries existed and drove productivity. The real competition was between American industrial production and the Axis power's ability to sink ships faster than they could be replaced. And American women, women like Rosie the Riveter, won that competition decisively. The training was difficult. The physical labor was exhausting. The dangers were real. But for many women working in World War II shipyards, the hardest challenge wasn't the work itself. It was the men they worked alongside. When women first entered the shipyards in large numbers during 1942 and 1943, they walked into workplaces that had been exclusively male for generations. The men who worked there didn't see them as colleagues. They saw them as invaders, as outsiders, as temporary workers who would disappear as soon as the war ended and the men came home. Local newspapers in shipyard towns reinforced this attitude. They described women as outsiders and a temporary solution to a labor problem. The message was clear. This wasn't women's place. They were only here because of the emergency. Once the crisis passed, they would go back where they belonged, back to the kitchen, back to the home. The hostility took many forms. Some men openly mocked the women, making jokes about their physical strength or their lack of experience. Comments like, "Can you even lift that?" or "Maybe you should leave this to the men," were constant. Women had to endure these remarks every single day, knowing that any response might be used as proof that they were too emotional, too sensitive, too weak for this kind of work. Other men engaged in more subtle sabotage. They would refuse to help women who needed assistance with heavy equipment. They would withhold information about procedures or safety protocols, setting women up to fail. Foremen would assign women to the most dangerous or physically demanding tasks, hoping they would quit. The strategy was simple: make the work environment so hostile that women would leave on their own. Sexual harassment was pervasive. Women working at the Vancouver Kaiser Shipyard in Washington State later recalled incidents of inappropriate comments, unwanted touching, and explicit propositions from male coworkers and supervisors. One woman had to request a transfer to a different department because the harassment from male coworkers became unbearable. Another woman described how a foreman would corner her in isolated areas of the ship under construction, making advances that she couldn't report without risking her job. The problem was structural. There were no protections for women who experienced harassment, no human resources departments to file complaints with, no workplace harassment policies, no legal framework that recognized sexual harassment as discrimination. Women who complained were often dismissed as troublemakers or accused of inviting the attention. The attitude was that if women wanted to work in a man's world, they had to accept being treated like one of the men, which in practice meant accepting behavior that no one should have to tolerate. Union resistance added another layer of difficulty. While unions eventually accepted women members because they had no choice, many union leaders made it clear that women weren't truly welcome. Women were often paid less than men for doing identical work. When women complained about wage discrimination, they were told that men had families to support, as if women didn't. The assumption was that women were working for pin money, for extra spending cash, not because they needed to survive. Some women fought back. They filed grievances through the unions, though those grievances were rarely taken seriously. They documented incidents of harassment and discrimination, though there was rarely anyone to show the documentation to. They formed support networks with other women, watching out for each other and warning each other about men who were particularly problematic. At the Boston Navy Yard, women faced skepticism from day one. Between 15 and 20% of shipyard workers were women, numbering over 8,000 in 1943. These women were thrown into roles that the shipbuilding world had not previously opened to them. Male workers questioned whether women could handle the physical demands. Male supervisors assigned women to prove themselves constantly, setting standards higher than those applied to male workers. A woman welder had to produce welds that were not just adequate but perfect. A woman riveter had to work not just as fast as men but faster. A woman crane operator had to demonstrate not just competence but mastery. Because every woman knew that if she failed, it wouldn't be seen as an individual failure. It would be proof that women couldn't do the work. Mildred Oppid, who worked as a welder building landing ship, tank vessels in Pittsburgh, later recalled that women welded more carefully than men because they had something to prove. Quote, "They didn't care, but we did. We wanted to do good, so we did," end quote. That extra care, that determination to prove their worth, resulted in welds that were often superior to those made by male workers. But it also meant that women carried a psychological burden that men didn't have to bear. The pressure was relentless. Every mistake was magnified. Every success was dismissed as luck or as an exception. Women who excelled at their jobs were accused of sleeping with supervisors to get ahead. Women who struggled were told they should go home and let the men do the real work. There was no way to win. Some women internalized the discrimination. They began to doubt their own abilities, wondering if maybe the men were right, maybe they weren't cut out for this kind of work. Others became angry, frustrated by the constant need to prove themselves in ways that men never had to. Still others developed a thick skin, learning to ignore the comments, brush off the harassment, and focus on doing the job they were hired to do. But the psychological toll was real. Women who should have felt proud of their contributions to the war effort instead felt isolated, undervalued, and unwelcome. They were building the ships that would win the war, and their male coworkers treated them like they were barely competent to sweep the floors. And this was happening while their husbands, brothers, and sons were fighting overseas. While they were sacrificing their time, their health, and their safety to support the war effort. While they were proving, day after day, that they were just as capable as any man. The irony was bitter. America was fighting a war against fascism, against regimes that denied basic human dignity and equality. And yet, here at home, women working in defense industries were being treated as second-class citizens in their own workplaces. They were good enough to build the ships when men weren't available, but not good enough to be treated with respect. Some women quit because of the harassment. Others persevered because they needed the income or because they were determined not to let the men drive them out. But every woman who worked in the shipyards during World War II has stories about sexism, about discrimination, about fighting battles that had nothing to do with welding or riveting and everything to do with proving that they deserved to be there. This was the second front, not in Europe or the Pacific, but right there in American shipyards. And women fought that battle every single day, shift after shift, for the entire duration of the war. The shift ended at 5 in the evening. Helen punched out, exhausted, her arms aching from hours of welding, her ears still ringing from the noise. She walked to the parking lot with the other workers, got into her car, and began the hour-long drive home. But her day wasn't over. Not even close. When she arrived home, her children needed dinner. The house needed cleaning. Laundry had piled up throughout the week. Groceries needed to be bought, though that meant standing in line at multiple stores because rationing meant you couldn't get everything you needed in one place. Her husband was serving somewhere in the Pacific. She hadn't heard from him in 3 weeks. The last letter said he was fine, but she had no way of knowing if that was still true. This was the reality for millions of American women during World War II. They worked full-time in shipyards, factories, and defense plants. Then they went home and worked a second full-time job taking care of their families. This expectation plagued shipbuilding women everywhere. Rather than solely fulfilling their patriotic duty by building ships for the war effort, women were expected to accomplish both functions simultaneously: welding, lifting loads, and sweeping at the shipyard before going home to clean, cook meals, and care for children. This left them little to no time for rest or personal activities. The double burden wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a systematic problem that affected every aspect of women's lives. Think about the math. An 8 or 9-hour shift at the shipyard. Add an hour or 2 for commuting. That's 10 or 11 hours already. Then cooking dinner takes an hour. Cleaning the house takes another hour or 2. Helping children with homework, putting them to bed, mending clothes, preparing lunches for the next day, all of this takes more time. Mildred Kane, a teacher at Kaiser's Child Care Center, was a victim of this overwhelming schedule and remembered that, quote, "We were just frantic on the 7th day. Sundays, we didn't know whether to clean the house and wash our hair or rush off and go on a picnic or rest," end quote. As a single woman, Kane had more choice in the matter. Women with families often had no other option than to tackle household chores on their day off. Stella Vogel, a tank cleaner at Kaiser, recalled the tension created by working different shifts from her husband. Quote, "At 11 o'clock, I had to fix his lunch and get him ready. We worked different shifts. He worked the midnight shift. On my day off, I'd have to do the washing and ironing. And on his day off, he went to the movies all day long. I can remember him being there," end quote. Eventually, the couple ended up seeking a divorce. The shift rotation made everything worse. Women worked day shifts one week, swing shifts the next week, and graveyard shifts the week after that. Their bodies never adjusted. They were constantly exhausted, trying to sleep during the day when children needed supervision, trying to stay awake at night when their bodies demanded rest. And society offered almost no support. Husbands who were still at home often refused to help with household tasks because they considered it women's work. Extended family members might pitch in occasionally, but most women were on their own. Childcare was a massive problem. The Kaiser Shipyards recognized this issue and did something revolutionary. They operated child care centers that were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This meant that workers on all shifts could drop off their children and know they would be cared for while they worked. The centers provided meals, educational activities, and medical care. Some even had facilities for mildly ill children so that mothers didn't have to miss work. This was unprecedented. Before the war, the idea that employers should provide childcare would have been considered absurd. But Kaiser understood that if he wanted to recruit and retain women workers, he had to address the practical barriers that prevented them from working. The child care centers were expensive to operate, but they paid for themselves by reducing absenteeism and turnover. Still, even with child care available, the burden was immense. Women woke up before dawn, got their children ready, dropped them at the child care center, worked an 8 or 9-hour shift doing physically demanding and dangerous labor, picked up their children, went home, made dinner, cleaned the house, helped with homework, did laundry, and collapsed into bed for a few hours before waking up to do it all over again. Housing shortages in shipyard towns made everything harder. Richmond, California, saw its population explode from 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943. There simply weren't enough houses, apartments, or even rooms to rent. Families doubled up, with multiple families sharing single homes. Some workers lived in temporary trailer parks or makeshift housing that lacked basic amenities. The lack of housing meant longer commutes. Women who couldn't find housing near the shipyards had to travel 2 hours each way. That added 4 hours to an already impossible day. They carpooled because gas was rationed and personal vehicles were scarce. But even carpooling meant coordinating schedules, finding reliable partners, and dealing with the logistics of who drove when. Shopping for food became a major challenge. Rationing meant that sugar, meat, butter, coffee, and many other staples were limited. Women had to stand in line at multiple stores, presenting ration stamps and hoping the stores hadn't run out of whatever they needed. A simple grocery trip could take hours. And this had to be done on their day off, the one day when they might have been able to rest. Some women cracked under the pressure. They developed health problems from exhaustion. They experienced mental breakdowns from the constant stress. They made mistakes at work because they were too tired to concentrate, mistakes that sometimes resulted in injuries. But most women kept going because they had no choice. They needed the income. Their families depended on them. And they believed in the cause. The government's propaganda campaigns showed smiling women in clean coveralls, looking fresh and energetic. The reality was women with dark circles under their eyes, women who hadn't had a full night's sleep in months, women whose hands shook from exhaustion as they tried to weld another joint or drive another rivet. And here's what made it even more frustrating. When men worked in defense industries, they were praised for their patriotism and their hard work. No one expected them to also cook, clean, and care for children when they got home. But when women did the exact same work, they were expected to maintain their households as if they had all day to do it. The double standard was blatant. Stella Vogel's husband went to the movies on his day off while she did laundry and ironing. This wasn't unusual. This was typical. Men working in defense industries came home and relaxed. Women working in defense industries came home and started their second shift. Some women tried to push back against these expectations. They asked their husbands to help with household tasks. They hired housekeepers if they could afford it. They let the house stay messy, prioritizing sleep over cleaning. But society judged them harshly for these choices. A woman who didn't keep a spotless house was failing as a homemaker, regardless of how many hours she worked at the shipyard. The propaganda posters never showed this side of the story. Rosie the Riveter flexing her arm didn't show the same woman collapsing into bed at midnight, too exhausted to even change out of her work clothes. The cheerful images of women welders didn't show them standing in line for an hour to buy rationed meat for dinner. But the women kept going. They worked their shifts at the shipyards. They came home and took care of their families. They got a few hours of sleep and then woke up to do it all over again. They did this for months, for years, for the entire duration of the war. And when the war finally ended, When the ships stopped being built and the men came home and women were pushed out of their jobs, society acted like their contributions had been a temporary aberration. Like they had just been filling in until the real workers returned. Like the double shift they had worked for years had been easy or natural or not worth recognizing. But the women remembered. They remembered the exhaustion, the stress, the constant juggling of responsibilities that should never have fallen entirely on their shoulders. They remembered what they had accomplished despite the obstacles. And that memory would eventually fuel demands for change, for equality, for recognition that women could do any job and deserved support in doing it. The Richmond Kaiser Shipyards in California weren't just shipyards. They were an industrial empire. Between 1941 and 1945, 4 separate Kaiser yards stretched along the northeast shoreline of San Francisco Bay, transforming the small city of Richmond into the greatest shipbuilding center in the world. Kaiser Richmond Yard No. 1 was built on unoccupied land with construction starting in December 1940. In April 1941, the keel for the first British-bound ocean ship was laid. The next series of ships built were Liberty ships, with the first keel laid on May 15, 1942. Needing faster cargo ships, the yard switched to building Victory ships, with the first keel laid on January 17, 1944. By the time the yard closed in 1946, Yard No. 1 had built 30 ocean ships, 138 Liberty ships, and 82 Victory ships. Kaiser Richmond Yard No. 2 started as a joint project between Kaiser Permanente Metals Corporation and Todd Shipyards Corporation. Construction of its first Liberty ship at the site started in September 1941. Kaiser purchased Todd's interest in the yard in 1942 and renamed it Kaiser Richmond No. 2 Yard. The yard started by working 6 keels at a time and at its peak was working on 12 keels simultaneously. Most ships were being built in under 30 days. By the end of the war in 1945, Yard No. 2 had built 353 Liberty ships, 21 Haskell-class attack transports, and 66 Victory cargo ships. Kaiser Richmond Yard No. 3 was different from the others. Instead of traditional shipways, Yard No. 3 used graving basins, a revolutionary construction method borrowed from European shipbuilding. The basins measured 100 feet wide and 590 feet long. Ships were built in these concrete pits, then the basins were flooded and the completed vessels floated out. This allowed for more efficient use of space and eliminated the need for launching ceremonies. Each basin had craneways running between them, 35 feet wide, equipped with one 45-ton whirly crane and one 60-ton whirly crane. The craneways had an asphalt surface so that trucks and trailers could deliver materials directly to ships under construction in the basins. Below the craneways were galleries that provided space for tool storage and tasks like pipe threading. Freight could be lowered into the galleries by means of hatches in the deck. Yard No. 3 opened in 1943 and built Kaiser's largest ships, the Type C4, Class General G.O., Squire-class transport ships. These ships had a length of 523 feet, much longer than Liberty or Victory ships. By the war's end, Yard No. 3 had built 35 of these massive transports. The yard closed in 1946, but was never dismantled. Today, it remains largely intact, a California historical landmark and a U.S. National Register of Historic Place. The General Warehouse at Richmond Shipyard No. 3 still stands, an impressive 4-story structure that played a crucial role in the final outfitting of ships. From this warehouse, ships received their finishing touches: blankets, mops, brooms, dishes, tools, and everything else needed for a functioning vessel. The massive square concrete building is now part of the Rosie the Riveter / World War II Homefront National Historical Park. Docked at berth 5 in Yard No. 3 is the SS Red Oak Victory, a VC2, S. AP-2 Victory ship that has been preserved as a museum ship. Built in 88 days and launched on November 7, 1944, the Red Oak Victory represents the thousands of ships constructed at Richmond and serves as a tangible reminder of what women and men accomplished there. Across all 4 Richmond yards, the scale of production was staggering. 747 ships were built between 1941 and 1945. That's 18% of all Liberty ships built during the war. The Richmond yards held 2 significant speed records: the lowest average number of construction days per ship among all Liberty shipbuilding programs at 42 days, and the fastest single ship completed from keel laying to launch, the SS Robert E. Peary at 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The workforce required to achieve this production level was enormous. At its peak, over 90,000 workers were employed at the Richmond yards. 1/3 of them were women. That's 30,000 women welding, riveting, fitting pipes, installing electrical systems, operating cranes, and doing every other job necessary to build ships. Phyllis Key Gould, now 98 years old, recalled her time at the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond. Quote, "I had never worked before in my life," end quote, she said while standing next to the Rosie the Riveter memorial at the site of the former shipyard. She became a welder, learning to love the work despite its dangers. Quote, "I adored the appearance of welding, the scent of it. You'd peer through really dark glass, and all you would see was the arc. You'd move the welding in small, circular motions, crafting half-crescents. When done correctly, it was stunning. It resembled embroidery," end quote. Bethina Moore had a different experience. Weighing just 110 pounds, she was assigned one of the most perilous jobs, descending a narrow steel ladder attached to a welding machine for stories down into the ship's double hulls. Quote, "It was dark and frightening. It felt sorrowful because a war was ongoing. You understood your purpose. The men overseas might not return. Lives were at stake, so the welding had to be flawless," end quote. The Kaiser Shipyards were revolutionary in providing support for their workers. They operated child care centers that were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, allowing workers on all shifts to have access. The centers provided meals, educational activities, and medical care. Some even had facilities for mildly ill children so that mothers didn't have to miss work. This was unprecedented in American industry. Kaiser also established medical facilities at the shipyards that would later become the foundation for Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare organizations in the United States. Workers had access to on-site medical care for injuries and illnesses. This reduced lost work time and ensured that minor injuries were treated before they became serious. The shipyards employed prefabricated construction techniques that were revolutionary for their time. Entire sections of ships were built in fabrication shops throughout the country and then transported to Richmond for final assembly. The prefabrication plant assembly building, a magnificent timber truss structure, was where these sections were put together before being moved to the shipways or basins. Fabrication shops at Richmond produced more than 1,000 tons of steel components per day. Prefabricated subcontractors included Graham Ship Repair Company, Herrick Iron Works, Independent Iron Works, Berkeley's Trailer Company of America, Steel Tank and Pipe Company, California Steel Products Corporation, Pacific Coast Engineering in Alameda, and Clyde W. Wood in Stockton. This network of suppliers allowed Kaiser to maintain the breakneck pace of production. Richmond's population exploded from 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943. Nearly 500,000 African Americans migrated to California during the war years, with about 15,000 settling in Richmond alone. This was the largest voluntary migration of African Americans westward in the nation's history. Women, many of whom were African American, constituted over a quarter of the 90,000 workers in the Kaiser Richmond shipyards. The diversity of the workforce was remarkable. Photographer Dorothea Lange documented the Richmond shipyards during the war, capturing images of women and men of all races working side by side. Her photographs show women welding, women operating machinery, women in hard hats climbing scaffolds. These images preserve a moment when American industry, driven by wartime necessity, briefly became more inclusive than it had ever been before. The ships built at Richmond sailed to every theater of the war. Liberty ships carried cargo to Europe and the Pacific. Victory ships, faster and more capable, transported troops and supplies to the front lines. Haskell-class attack transports carried 1,500 soldiers each into combat zones. Type C-4 transport ships, the largest vessels built at Richmond, moved entire military units across the oceans. Every one of these ships represented thousands of hours of labor by women who had never expected to work in heavy industry. Women like Phyllis Key Gould, who had never worked before in her life, but became a skilled welder. Women like Bethina Moore, who conquered her fear and descended into the dark holes to make the welds that would keep ships afloat. Women who set aside their own comfort and safety because the war demanded it. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards had built more ships than any other shipbuilding location in the world. 747 vessels, representing millions of tons of steel, billions of rivets and welds, and the labor of tens of thousands of workers, including 30,000 women. It was an achievement that would never be repeated. The Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond weren't alone. Across the United States, shipyards were employing women in unprecedented numbers, each contributing to the massive production effort that would ultimately win the war. At the Boston Navy Yard in Charlestown, Massachusetts, women faced skepticism but proved their capabilities. Between 15 and 20% of shipyard workers were women. Numbering over 8,000 in 1943, these women were thrown into roles that the shipbuilding world had not previously opened to them. In May 1943, 27-year-old Mary O'Brien walked into the Charlestown Navy Yard seeking employment. She became one of thousands of women who would work there during the war. Though some worked in clerical positions that had been deemed acceptable for women since World War I, the great majority became welders and electricians, machine operators and pipe fitters, mechanics and painters. The Boston Navy Yard's newspaper, Shipyard News, featured women of all backgrounds in its wartime pages: college-educated women, girls fresh from high school, married women, grandmothers, women with husbands or brothers fighting overseas. As their faces smile up from the newsprint, the challenges they recounted cannot be overlooked. They worked in extreme conditions with dangerous tools and materials, sometimes alongside male employees who did not believe that they were up to the job. Women took their tools to the hulls of new ships under construction or spent their workdays in one of the many specialized shops that produced ship components. They were kept separate from Navy personnel berthed on ships in repair or overhaul. When they returned home after their 8 or 9-hour shift, they were expected to shop, cook, clean, care for children, and attend to other duties of women in the home. Nationally, the employment of women in Navy yards grew dramatically. In May 1943, 45,174 women were employed in Continental Navy yards, not including the new activities at Terminal Island and Hunters Point. Slightly more than half of these, 24,151, were employed on production work. The average percentage of women employed in all groups by the 9 Navy yards at that time was 13.6%, but the percentage varied widely in individual yards. By July 1943, the percentage had risen to 15.2% and the total employment to 53,080 out of a total of 348,955. The percentage continued to rise, reaching 16.9% in March 1944 and 17.8% in December of the same year. To manage this influx of women workers, Navy Yards established personnel departments in May 1943. Each shop had personnel supervisors, usually quartermaster mechanics selected for ability in personnel relations. Provision was made for a personnel assistant, preferably a woman with mechanic experience who could assist the personnel supervisor with problems peculiar to the women employees. This form of organization was found to work well and contributed greatly to success in handling women workers. The Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore, Maryland, was one of two new emergency shipyards established by the Maritime Commission under the Emergency Shipbuilding Program in 1941. Located on the south shore of the middle branch of the Patapsco River, the Fairfield Yard had the most employees of any Bethlehem shipyard, 44,625 in 1943. It had one of the finest construction records of the war. Women worked at Fairfield alongside men, building Liberty ships and later Victory ships. The yard's massive size and production capacity made it a critical part of the nation's shipbuilding effort. Like other shipyards, Fairfield employed women in roles ranging from welding and riveting to crane operation and electrical work. The Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation in Portland, Oregon, was the other emergency shipyard established by the Maritime Commission in 1941. Oregon Shipbuilding built 99 Victory ships along with 330 Liberty ships and 33 attack transports. Women made up a significant portion of the workforce, proving their capabilities in the Pacific Northwest just as they did on the East Coast. California Shipbuilding Corporation, also known as CalShip, operated a shipyard in Wilmington, California. The SS American Victory, a VC-2S, AP-2 type cargo ship, was built there in just 55 days and delivered to the U.S. War Shipping Administration on May 20, 1945. Women welders and riveters contributed to CalShip's impressive production record. The Vancouver Shipyard in Washington State, operated by Kaiser, had an output that included 31 Victory ships, 16 Liberty ships, 49 escort carriers, 21 troop transport ships, and 30 LST landing ships. Over 31,000 women worked at the three Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver and Portland by 1944. In total, these three shipyards produced over 700 ships, accounting for 30% of all ship production under the U.S. Maritime Commission. Women at the Vancouver shipyard faced many of the same challenges as their counterparts elsewhere. Sexual harassment from male coworkers and supervisors was common. Local newspapers described women as outsiders and a temporary solution. Some women had to request transfers to different departments because of harassment. But they persevered, contributing to a production record that was essential to the war effort. At the J.A. Jones Brunswick Shipyard in Georgia, women became known as the ladies who launch. They welded, riveted, and assembled ships in the hot, humid climate of the South. Like women everywhere, they faced discrimination and skepticism, but proved their capabilities through their work. The geographic distribution of these shipyards meant that women across the country were contributing to the war effort. From California to Massachusetts, from Oregon to Georgia, women were building the ships that would carry troops and supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific. This was a truly national mobilization, involving hundreds of thousands of women in dozens of cities. The diversity of the women workers reflected America's diversity. White women and African American women worked side by side, though often in segregated facilities or departments. College-educated women worked alongside women who had barely finished high school. Young women in their late teens worked alongside grandmothers in their 60s. Some were single. Some were married with children. Some had husbands fighting overseas. Some had lost husbands or sons in the war. What they all had in common was a determination to contribute. They believed in the cause. They wanted to support the men fighting overseas. They wanted to prove that women could do any job, no matter how difficult or dangerous. And they wanted the paycheck because many of them desperately needed the income. The ships they built sailed to every theater of the war. Victory ships transported troops to Normandy for D-Day. Liberty ships carried cargo across the submarine-infested Atlantic. Attack transports landed soldiers on Pacific islands. LSTs delivered tanks and vehicles directly onto beaches. Escort carriers provided air cover for convoys. Every one of these vessels was built, at least in part, by women. Women made the welds that held the hulls together. Women drove the rivets that secured the joints. Women installed the electrical systems that powered the ships. Women operated the cranes that lifted massive sections into place. Without women workers, the United States could not have produced enough ships to win the war. This wasn't just about Kaiser in Richmond or the Boston Navy Yard. This was about a national network of shipyards, large and small, all employing women, all contributing to the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. The scale was unprecedented. The achievement was extraordinary, and women made it possible. June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in military history. Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, landing on the beaches of Normandy, France, with a force that included 7,000 ships and landing craft and 195,000 naval personnel from Allied countries. By the end of the month, more than 850,000 military personnel had landed on the shores of Normandy. And what carried them there? Ships. Thousands of ships. Liberty ships. Victory ships. Attack transports. Landing craft. Every one of them built in American shipyards. Many of them built, at least in part, by women. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, a Liberty ship, supported the D-Day invasions by ferrying supplies between Great Britain and Normandy, France, 11 times. Victory ships, faster and more capable than Liberty ships, transported troops, ammunition, food, fuel, and supplies. 97 of the Victory ships were fitted out as troop carriers. The others carried the material necessities of war. Victory ships formed a critical maritime link to the theaters of war. These fast, large-capacity carriers served honorably in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. They sailed across submarine-infested waters, braving German U-boats that had sunk thousands of Allied vessels in the early years of the war. They crossed the Pacific, delivering supplies to American forces island-hopping toward Japan. The SS Red Oak Victory, built at Richmond Shipyard No. 3 in 88 days, carried ammunition throughout the Pacific Theater. Ships like the Red Oak Victory made possible the victories at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Without a constant stream of supplies, fuel, and ammunition, American forces could not have sustained their offensive operations. The Battle of the Atlantic was one of the most important campaigns of the Second World War. It was certainly the longest, lasting 2,074 days from 1939 to 1945. German U-boats sought to destroy as many supply ships as possible, cutting off Britain from American aid and starving the island nation into submission. In the early years of the war, the U-boats were winning. In 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 1,000 Allied vessels. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. But American shipyards, powered by women's labor, changed the equation. By 1943, Kaiser workers were producing a Liberty ship on average in just 42 days, completing 3 each day. By 1944, Henry Kaiser and his colleagues were building 50 merchant ships a day across all American shipyards. The United States was finally building ships faster than Germany could sink them. And the Victory ships, with their speeds of 15 to 17 knots, could outrun most U-boats on the surface. They could cross the Atlantic faster, reducing time spent in dangerous waters. They could carry more cargo per voyage, increasing overall shipping capacity. The Victory ships represented the technological edge that helped turn the Battle of the Atlantic in the Allies' favor. Convoy routes spanned 2,000 to 8,000 miles across the Atlantic and Pacific. Ships traveled in groups, protected by destroyers and escort carriers, many of which were also built in American shipyards by women workers. The convoys brought food to Britain, which was under strict rationing and dependent on imports for survival. They brought munitions, weapons, tanks, trucks, and aircraft to support Allied operations in Europe and North Africa. In the Pacific, Victory ships supported the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces closer to Japan with each victory. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked a turning point in naval operations, Allied forces gained an offensive hold that would ultimately lead to victory. But that victory required constant resupply of forward bases scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Victory ships carried ammunition for the guns. They carried fuel for the aircraft. They carried food for the soldiers. They carried medical supplies for the wounded. They carried everything an army needed to fight a war thousands of miles from home. Without those ships, without the constant flow of supplies they provided, the American military could not have operated. And who built those ships? Women. Women welders who made sure every joint was strong enough to withstand the stress of rough seas. Women riveters who drove hundreds of thousands of rivets to hold the hulls together. Women electricians who installed the systems that kept the ships running. Women crane operators who lifted massive sections into place. Women shipfitters, machinists, painters, and countless others who contributed their skills to building vessels that would help win the war. The statistics are staggering. 531 Victory ships built between 1944 and 1946. Over 2,700 Liberty ships built during the war. 747 ships built at the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards alone. Hundreds more built at Boston, Baltimore, Portland, Vancouver, and shipyards across the nation. Each ship represented thousands of hours of labor. Each ship represented millions of pounds of steel, miles of electrical wiring, thousands of valves and pumps, complex machinery, and precise construction. Each ship represented women pushing themselves beyond what they thought they were capable of, working through exhaustion and pain and fear because the alternative was unthinkable. VE Day came on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Germany surrendered. American and Allied forces had prevailed in the European theater. The ships built by American women had carried the troops and supplies that made that victory possible. VJ Day came on August 15, 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Victory over Japan. The war was over. American forces had defeated the Japanese Empire. The ships built by American women had carried the troops and supplies that made that victory possible. The women in the shipyards heard the news. Germany had surrendered. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. They had done it. They had built the ships. They had contributed to the victory. They had proved that women could do any job, no matter how difficult or dangerous. For a moment, there was celebration. Relief that the war was finally over. Pride in what they had accomplished. Joy that husbands and sons and brothers would be coming home. But that moment didn't last long, because almost immediately, the shipyards started laying off women workers. The war was over. The emergency was over. And women, the propaganda had always said, were just a temporary solution. Now it was time for them to go back where they belonged. The women had built the ships that won the war, and their reward was to be pushed out of their jobs and told to go home. The layoffs started almost immediately after V-Day and accelerated after VJ Day. Employment opportunities were limited almost entirely to veterans, who received preference in nearly all plants. In 48 large plants with 160,000 total employees, 4,000 veterans were hired in December 1945, despite net employment declines of 2,000 jobs. The airframe industry, which had employed hundreds of thousands of women during the war, now prioritized veterans. The rubber tires and tubes industry, which had been roughly 20% female since it became critical in mid-1944, noted that women to be displaced. Many employers have indicated to the users that they expect to replace most of the women on the production line with men. The ordnance industry, which had employed massive numbers of women, all but disappeared in 1945. Cutbacks in the industry after V-Day and continuing with VJ Day dropped total employment in ordnance plants from 1,360,000 in March 1945 to 250,000 by September. The female employment share dropped from 33% to 23%. Government employment also declined significantly. Federal civilian employment in February 1946 stood at roughly 2.4 million, more than 500,000 less than at the time of Japan's surrender. While total employment shrank, many veterans returned to reclaim their old jobs at the end of 1945. The female share of federal jobs declined from wartime peaks of 38% to 28% by year-end 1946 and 22% by 1950. The displacement wasn't voluntary. Women continued to apply for jobs from the United States Employment Service in large numbers. The users received more than 660,000 new applications for work from women in the first quarter of 1946. But by this point, users' placements had shifted towards veterans. In January 1945, the users received 105,942 job applications from veterans, which represented 54% of the application pool, and placed 77,735 veterans that same month, for 7% of the total. In December, the users received 644,448 new applications from veterans, 66% of the total, and placed 116,793, 31% of the total. Despite the fact that total placements declined by 65% over this same period, veteran placement shares increased roughly 4 times as much as veterans' application shares. The message was clear. Veterans, almost all of whom were men, received priority in hiring. Women, no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced, no matter how much they needed the income, were expected to step aside. The gains made during the Second World War proved transitory as women were demobilized from men's work to make way for the returning servicemen. Society, government, unions, and employers all conspired to push women out of industrial jobs. The propaganda machine that had urged women to take factory jobs during the war now urged them to return to domestic life. A government report on the status of women workers after World War II called back to the popular Rosie the Riveter campaign during the war, but the message had changed. Rosie was no longer needed. Rosie should go home and let the men have the jobs. Many women resisted. They wanted to keep their jobs. They needed the income. They had proven they could do the work. But resistance was futile. Employers fired women en masse. Unions, which had never fully accepted women members, did nothing to protect them. The government, which had recruited women with patriotic appeals, now abandoned them. Some women found work in traditionally female occupations: secretaries, teachers, nurses, retail clerks. But these jobs paid far less than shipyard work. Women who had earned substantial wages as welders or riveters now had to survive on a fraction of that income. Other women left the workforce entirely, whether by choice or necessity. They returned to domestic life, raising children, keeping house, performing the unpaid labor that society expected of them. But many of these women never forgot what they had accomplished during the war. They never forgot that they had done jobs society said were impossible for women. The post-war years were difficult for women who had worked in defense industries. They faced discrimination in the job market. They faced social pressure to conform to traditional gender roles. They faced the psychological toll of being told that their wartime contributions, as significant as they were, didn't matter enough to earn them a permanent place in the workforce. But something had changed. The door had been opened, even if only slightly. Women had proven, beyond any doubt, that they could do any job men could do. They had built ships. They had operated cranes. They had welded and riveted and fitted pipes and installed electrical systems. They had done it all while facing discrimination, harassment, and a double burden of work at the shipyard and work at home. That knowledge, that experience, would not be forgotten. The women who worked in the shipyards during World War II would pass on their stories to their daughters and granddaughters. They would become a living reminder that women's capabilities extended far beyond what society traditionally allowed. The fight didn't end in 1945 or 1946. The fight continued, quietly at first, then louder as the decades passed. The seeds had been planted, and in the 1960s and 70s, those seeds would grow into a movement that would transform American society. The women who built victory ships during World War II didn't immediately change American society. In the years immediately after the war, gender roles largely reverted to pre-war norms. Women were expected to be homemakers. Men were expected to be breadwinners. The industrial jobs that women had performed so capably during the war were once again reserved for men. But the memory remained. Phyllis Key Gould, who welded at the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, carried her welding certificate in her wallet for decades. Her arms bore faint white scars from metal sparkles, molten slag that had slipped into her sleeves and gloves while she welded overhead. Those scars were a physical reminder of what she had accomplished. Bethina Moore, who had descended into the dark double hulls of ships under construction, never forgot the fear she conquered. Mildred Oppett, who welded with such precision that she could spot the difference between a woman's weld and a man's, never forgot the pride she felt in her work. Rose Benavida, who set a record by driving 3,345 rivets in one shift, never forgot that President Roosevelt personally congratulated her. These women, and hundreds of thousands like them, had experienced something extraordinary. They had stepped outside the boundaries that society had drawn around women's lives. They had done work that was considered impossible for women. They had earned substantial wages, achieving economic independence that most women of their generation never experienced. And then they had been told to go home and forget about it. But they couldn't forget. They wouldn't forget. In the 1960s, a new generation of women began demanding equality. They demanded equal pay for equal work. They demanded access to jobs that were traditionally reserved for men. They demanded recognition that women's capabilities extended far beyond domestic labor. And when older women heard these demands, many of them remembered their own experiences during World War II. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s had many causes and many origins. But one important strand was the memory of what women had accomplished during World War II. The women who had built ships, who had welded and riveted and operated cranes, they became living proof that women could do any job. Some of these women became activists, joining organizations that fought for women's rights. Others simply told their stories to their daughters and granddaughters, passing on the knowledge that women were capable of far more than society traditionally allowed. Still others served as role models, showing younger women that it was possible to break through barriers and succeed in male-dominated fields. The Rosie the Riveter / World War II home front National Historical Park was established to preserve the history of the home front during World War II. Located at the site of the former Richmond Kaiser Shipyards, the park includes the SS Red Oak Victory Museum ship, the General Warehouse from Shipyard No. 3, and interpretive exhibits that tell the story of the men and women who built ships to win the war. In 2000, a memorial to Rosie the Riveter was dedicated at the Richmond Shipyard site. Phyllis Key Gould attended the ceremony, standing near the place where she had worked more than 50 years earlier. Quote, "I love the work," end quote, she said, smiling at the memory. The memorial recognizes not just the women who worked at Richmond, but all the women who contributed to the war effort by working in defense industries. It acknowledges that women played a crucial role in winning World War II, a role that was often overlooked or minimized in the decades immediately after the war. The SS Red Oak Victory, built in 88 days at Richmond Shipyard No. 3, is now permanently docked as a museum ship. Visitors can tour the vessel, seeing firsthand the tight spaces where women welded, the decks where women worked, the machinery women operated. The ship serves as a tangible reminder of what was accomplished during those frantic war years. The legacy of women shipbuilders extends beyond historical memory. It extends into the present day, where women continue to work in trades that were once considered exclusively male. Women welders, women electricians, women crane operators, they all walk in the footsteps of the women who built victory ships during World War II. The barriers haven't all fallen. Women in skilled trades still face discrimination and skepticism. They still have to prove themselves in ways that men don't. But the door is open, in large part because of what women accomplished during World War II. The lesson is clear. When given the opportunity, women can do any job. The physical demands don't matter. The technical complexity doesn't matter. The tradition of male dominance doesn't matter. What matters is training, opportunity, and the determination to succeed. American women proved that during World War II. They built every single victory ship. They built hundreds of Liberty ships. They built attack transports and escort carriers and LSTs. They built the fleet that won the war. And in doing so, they changed America forever. They demonstrated that the boundaries society had drawn around women's lives were artificial and arbitrary. They showed that women were capable of strength, skill, and determination that equaled any man. The ships they built have long since sailed to scrap yards or been mothballed in reserve fleets. But the legacy remains. The memory remains. The lesson remains. Women built the ships that won World War II. And in doing so, they opened a door that would never fully close again. That is their legacy. That is what they accomplished. That is why we remember.